People calling in almost took me out in my cleaning business. I almost quit multiple times because I felt like I couldn't actually add clients to my cleaning business because I was too worried that people were going to call in and we wouldn't have coverage for the cleans. It was so messy because we would have people call in. I would have first-time cleans booked on that day. I wouldn't have anything to do about it. Like, I literally wouldn't have anybody else to bring in to cover those cleans other than myself. So I was like kind of the built-in buffer, but then it turned into me essentially going in to clean every single day as I was still trying to just do everything outside of the day-to-day operations, hire people, create systems, do all of the admin, everything. And so the system that I had of me like going in and being the buffer didn't really work all that well because again, it just kind of resulted in me being there on site literally every single day. I also think that I was a little bit resentful as somebody who just took a lot of pride in not having to reschedule cleans. So I would start to get like super frustrated and just upset because I would feel embarrassed and like I was letting my clients down when the team would call in, which obviously wasn't fair to the team because we should be able to set up the business to where if somebody calls in, not everything starts to crumble and break down. And we should also set it up to where obviously I'm not the only person who's like buffer within the schedule, because again, it just would result in me going in all the time, which is not ideal because then the rest of the business couldn't be tended to. I couldn't grow anymore because again, I would have to hire, but I didn't have time to hire because then I would be stuck with that trainee. It was just super messy. And I also felt like a little resentful because I was trying to like, literally when I was quoting people, I would present the value of going with a company rather than a solo cleaner. I wouldn't say anything bad about solo cleaners, but something that I would say is like for our commercial properties specifically, or for like our move out contracts that had like literal deadlines where we could not reschedule or we'd get fired from the account. I would tell them, you know, we will never reschedule on you. We will always make sure that the clean gets done. And so I would feel really weird saying that because I really knew how much of a struggle that was. And we would have to reschedule other people, like our residential clients, to make sure we didn't have to reschedule on the important ones of the day, like the Airbnbs or the move outs that had strict deadlines. So it just felt a little bit weird to have that as part of the value that we could provide, like in my pitch, when it was something that we were really, really struggling with, in all honesty, on the back end. So it felt really messy. And I think that the value that you can provide as a company is making sure that you're not rescheduling on people because people are calling in, right? You have those other teammates that can fill in. You've got things in place where you don't have to reschedule, but I just could not figure it out. I could not figure it out. So I have been bound and determined to do that, to find a solution to that issue. And I just wanted to share some of the like systems that I think have honestly changed the way that I even view people calling in. So let's get into the very first thing that I think you should be putting into place if you haven't already, because this is something that absolutely changed, again, the way that I kind of looked at call-ins. And it's a policy about calling in. So the policy isn't necessarily to make sure that, you know, nobody calls in ever again. I think that people should be able to take off work for personal reasons. They should be able to get sick and not have to worry about getting fired. Those are things that definitely need to be taken into consideration when you're creating a policy. But something that I struggled with personally was doing anything about people calling in. Like, I felt like they had to call in a billion times before I could ever even say anything. And then when it got to the point of me saying something, it was when I was essentially having that termination conversation. And it felt weird because I would essentially go from 0 to 100. Like I would let them do it until it got to a point where I could not physically let them do it anymore because it was creating so much friction in our operations and it was not fair to anybody else. But they wouldn't really know that because I wouldn't have any conversations in between. And it was not a good way to manage people. It didn't it wasn't fair to them because they didn't really have the right expectations for, you know, is this appropriate at this job? Is it, like, what is the policy here? There was none. There was no expectation. So the policy for me was more so about, okay, let's outline what is the expectation here, what's fair to everybody so that everybody is held to the same standard. Because again, it like, especially when I didn't have a policy in place, I might let one person call in 15 times in 2 months, and I might let another person 10 times, and they might both get terminated. And it just felt, when I looked back, like obviously in the moment I did what I thought was right for those specific situations, but looking back, I wish I would have, of course, had some sort of like very clear standard, and that standard could have been adhered to better by the team, and it would have been more fair to them, because they would have been able to see, okay, I've only got 3 left in the next month. How can I make sure that I don't use those? Like, how can I plan my life and plan whatever the personal situation is around this expectation that I know that I have at work? Because otherwise, just, it was so gray. That it was a gray area with so many things when I didn't have policies or like expectations in place, but this was a big one. One thing to take note of is that your state will have different guidelines and compliance for sick day policies or just like call-in policies. So make sure that you're checking your like government website for your state with like employment laws, because there are some states that, you know, you need to do like a point system. There are other states that have no rules really at all. You can just kind of make it up. There are some states that are super strict on it. So just make sure you're checking the state guidelines on that before you like come up with a policy. But I also think, keep in mind what you think is fair, and give grace to people on your team to be able to take off work if they need to. And we'll get into making sure that it doesn't absolutely like crush your operations when they do need to call in. Which leads me to the next thing that I think that you should put into place, and that is buffer in your schedule. I would always book us out to like 100%. And it was so hard because if anything went wrong, I was like the only person that could go in and help with that. So if we were running behind on a clean and it was going past 5 o'clock, there would be no recourse other than me go in after, you know, at the end of the clean, try to make sure that it was done by 5 o'clock. Most of the time it was, but sometimes it really wasn't. And so we would have to push cleans from that day to the next day because we just weren't done yet. I ensured that everybody was off at 5. That was something that I was always super conscious of, and that's a benefit that I wanted to give to my employees. But that promise that I made to my employees that they were going to get off at 5, without having any system in place to make sure that we could handle things going wrong throughout the day, cleans running late, it was a mess. The amount that I could work and cover each day just wasn't enough as like the system to cover things going wrong. So it was just chaos. So I recommend actually not ending your day at the very last minute that your cleaners technically get off work. I do like having them end at a certain time. So I still, if I were to have a company again, because I've sold my company now, but if I were to have a company again, I would love to be able to still say, you're going to be off at 5 and promise that and be able to actually adhere to that promise. But I also want to make sure that that doesn't mean that we're not getting cleans done. So instead of ending at 5, we would actually end at 3. So that gives you a 2-hour buffer for each team throughout the day, which I highly recommend. And that means that if your cleans do run behind, you have from 3 to 5 to essentially make sure that any of that like messy, maybe you had somebody call in, it takes longer than you thought, maybe you have a clean that's brand new that takes longer than you thought, maybe whatever the case is, you have from that 3 to 5 window of time to account for all of those things. You can be super strategic with what you do in that 3 to 5 window. Something that I think you shouldn't do with that little window of time is fill it with last minute requests. I think that you should intentionally keep those times open for anything that changes last minute day of with the clients that you already have booked. So I don't think you should fill that spot unless literally something goes wrong on your schedule. But you can do a bunch of things with making sure that every single clean that day has a lead on site, and also they have enough time to get it done. Especially if you have more than 2 teams, if you've got 3, 4, 5 teams, you could be so strategic with your routing to make sure that all the teams end around the same place. And that way, if anything goes wrong, you can take care of it at the end of the day with the teams that have buffer in their schedule. Because at that point, they'd only be 5-10 minutes away from each other, instead of having a certain team go save another one that's 30 minutes away, right? So you can be super intentional with routing to make sure everybody ends, all the teams for the day end in the same area. So again, you can account for things going wrong, and that window at the end of the day can actually be utilized in a super efficient way. Another system that I think that you should have, because it doesn't end with just those 2 systems, we have more, I think that you should also have people on call. So the way that I do this is I recommend like hiring on-callers. So this can be people who have worked for you before that end up, going to another job, and they just want shifts here and there. Those could be your on-call people. Essentially just have people that are designated to be on call for that day. Again, make sure that you're actually adhering to compliance with like what that looks like in your company, in the state that your business is in, but it's not complicated. Like, just make sure that you've got multiple layers of making sure you're covered if everything goes wrong and everybody calls in. So you've got, 2 people on call that day that want the hours, they want to come in and work, and you have work for them if somebody calls in. So can you kind of see where, if you had all of these things set up, where it's like, okay, you've got buffer in the schedule, you've got people who are on call, you've got that policy in place, so there's no like gray area, that automatically starts to lift the almost like negative energy around people calling in off your shoulders, because you're not going to start resenting people for calling in. You just start putting in the solutions. So it's like, okay, so let's see, buffer in the schedule, is that enough for today? Okay, no, we need like an additional hour of labor to cover everything, so let's go ahead and switch those savers over to make sure they're saving this team because they're the one that had the person call in. We need 1 more hour, so actually let's go ahead and just make everybody still end at 3 and pull in our person on call. Well, there you go. Now you're not having to call all of your clients, call your Airbnb clients, call your move-in clients who have somebody moving in the next day and tell them you actually can't make it to the clean. It's like a much less stressful environment, and I think that it means everything for your team and for you as a business owner to make sure that you've got a safe space for people to be able to take off, and it doesn't, again, crush your operations and make you feel resentful towards them. Okay, and last but not least, you'd be surprised, there's actually more than this, but last but not least, which I'll talk about on this video, is incentivized shifts. So I think that you should be able to pay incentivized shifts to cover as a last resort with everything that we've talked about so far. So obviously you don't want to immediately opt into incentivized shifts, meaning that you're paying more for people to cover them, because it does eat into your margin a little bit. But as a last resort, if again, still everything that I just talked about is not enough to cover the number of people who have called in, we want to make sure that we don't have to ever reschedule a client. So sending somebody in with an incentivized pay can be a good way to make sure that it actually gets covered. Now you're probably like, how can I afford this? Because we have like a tiny margin in cleaning companies typically, and especially if you're at 30 grand per month and below, your margin doesn't feel that big, even if it's 30%, right? So when you have a small margin, remember that like increasing the price that you charge clients does not just affect you as a business owner. It affects the way that your business operates and how that translates to employees' experience as well. So being able to pay your employees more with things like incentivized shifts, that's made possible by charging the amount that you need to cover that cost. So you can essentially run a projection on like the percentage of labor that you anticipate per month to be incentivized. And if you can have that number itemized in your projections, like your financial projections, which if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, go and watch my last video. But if you can have an itemized number in there with, okay, this percentage of labor is probably going to be at the incentivized shift amount, and everything still works, that means you're pricing the way that you need to. If it doesn't work and you literally don't have the money to pay incentivized shifts, probably means that you need to increase your price. I hope this is so helpful. I can't even begin to tell you how just messy and bad it felt to not have these systems in place, and for operations to just crumble every time somebody called in, and just the resentment that followed that. And obviously that's not a good, healthy way to run a business. It's not good for your employees. Just all around, it's a horrible way to do things, and putting these things in place can really help with that. It can help with morale. It can help with just making sure that your day-to-day isn't like chaotic and all that stuff. I could go on about it forever because I swear I literally almost like quit multiple times just because of this reason. So anyway, I hope all of these things are helpful. If you guys want me to talk more in depth about any of them, or you have any questions, please put it in the comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you in my next video.